July 4th, 1857. Just after midnight. Bayard Street, 5 Points, Lower Manhattan. A wooden club cracks across a man's skull, and he drops face first into a gutter already running black with sewage. His name is lost to history. He is the first body of the night. He will not be the last. Within 48 hours, at least 80 men will be dead, more than 100 wounded, storefronts torn apart, paving stones ripped from the street and hurled like cannonballs. And the 69th Regiment of the New York State Militia will be marching through Mulberry Street with fixed bayonets because the New York Police Department has completely lost control of the city. This wasn't a riot. This was a war. 2 armies of immigrants and nativists, thousands strong, fighting block by block over who owned America. The Dead Rabbits on one side, the Bowery Boys on the other, and behind them a dozen smaller gangs pouring out of tenements with bricks, axes, brass knuckles, and pistols. Cops who tried to intervene got beaten unconscious and stripped of their uniforms. Women threw bottles from rooftops. Children ran ammunition. When it was finally over, the gutters of Paradise Square were literally slick with blood. This is the story behind Martin Scorsese's Gangs of New York. Not the movie version, the real one. The one where every single gang Leonardo DiCaprio rattles off in that famous recruitment scene actually existed, fought, bled, and died in the filthiest square mile in 19th century America. And here's what the history books don't tell you. Scorsese didn't invent these names. He didn't exaggerate them. If anything, he cleaned them up. Because the truth about the Dead Rabbits, the Plug Uglies, the Swamp Angels, and the rest is stranger, bloodier, and more American than anything Hollywood could have written. This is every gang from the film, in order of appearance, with the real facts they don't teach you in school. You have to understand the ground first. 5 Points. The neighborhood sat at the intersection of 5 streets in what is today Chinatown and the area around Foley Square. In the 1820s, developers had drained a disease-ridden pond called the Collect, built cheap tenements on top of the soft landfill, and watched those buildings sink and rot within a decade. The stink of the old swamp came up through the floorboards. Pigs roamed the streets, eating garbage. A single tenement at 65 Mulberry Street, the notorious old brewery, housed more than 1,000 people in rooms the size of closets. Charles Dickens visited in 1842 and wrote that the air reeked of decay and that murder was so common nobody bothered to investigate. Into that neighborhood poured the starving Irish, fleeing the potato famine of 1845, arriving by the tens of thousands every year. They had nothing. They were hated. And because nobody was going to protect them, they protected themselves. That is how the gangs were born. The first Irish gang, the one that started everything, was the 40 Thieves, formed around 1825. Their headquarters was the back room of a grocery store at the corner of Center and Anthony Streets, owned by a woman named Rosanna Piers. She sold rotten vegetables out front and cheap whiskey out the back, and upstairs her tenants were pickpockets, muggers, and sneak thieves. The 40 Thieves were led by a man named Edward Coleman. They ran a simple, brutal operation. Each member had a nightly quota. Steal this much, mug this many people, bring it back to Rosanna's, and split it with the boss. Fail the quota, and you got beaten by your own crew. Coleman himself was eventually hanged in 1839 for beating his wife to death in a dispute over 2 cents she earned selling hot corn on Broadway. 2 cents. That was the economy of the 5 Points. Lives traded for pennies. Out of the 40 Thieves came the first splinter faction, the Carryonians, named for County Kerry in Ireland because that's where every one of them was born. They operated mostly around Center Street. They were smaller, tighter, almost a family organization. Their whole reason for existence was hatred of the English and anyone they thought was English sympathetic. If you walked into their territory and they didn't like your accent, you got stomped. Simple as that. They weren't big moneymakers. They were professional grudge holders. And they set the template. Every Irish gang that came after them was defined by which patch of the old country its members came from. Then came the Chichesters. Nobody is entirely sure where the name came from. Some say from a leader named Chichester. Others say it was Irish slang. What's documented is that they operated out of the same grocery store back rooms as everyone else. They were ferocious street fighters, and they were one of the original member gangs that eventually folded into the much larger Dead Rabbits coalition. The Chichesters liked cudgels, thick wooden clubs studded with nails. When they charged down Mulberry Street in formation, people locked their doors and prayed. The Wildcards came next, and they are the gang that accidentally created the Dead Rabbits. The Wildcards were founded by a liquor seller named Ted Roach, and they wore blue stripes on their pants to identify themselves in street fights. Around 1850, at a Wildcards meeting in a Five Points saloon, an argument broke out over leadership. Voices got loud. A cudgel came down on a table, and then somebody, nobody knows exactly who, picked up the carcass of a dead rabbit and threw it into the middle of the room. Depending on which account you believe, rabbit was either slang for a tough guy, a corruption of the Gaelic word rabid, meaning hulking fellow, or just what it sounds like, an actual dead animal used as an insult. The faction that walked out of that meeting took the dead rabbit as their symbol. They impaled it on a pike, they carried it into battle, and they became the most feared Irish gang in New York. The Dead Rabbits wore red stripes on their pants to distinguish themselves from the Wildcards' blue. They operated out of Mulberry Street. Their leader in the 1850s was a man known only as Mose, a 5 Points laborer who stood reportedly 6 feet 8 inches tall and fought with a paving stone in each fist. By 1857, the Dead Rabbits numbered in the hundreds and functioned as the enforcement arm of Tammany Hall, the democratic political machine that ran New York through bribery, patronage, and muscle. Election day meant the Dead Rabbits showed up at polling places, handed out pre-marked ballots, and beat anyone who tried to vote the other way. They got paid in cash, in jobs, in immunity from arrest. This is the moment organized crime and organized politics became the same thing in America. The Dead Rabbits were the prototype. Every mob family that came after, from the Morello clan to the Five Families, followed the same blueprint. Deliver the vote, get protected, get rich. Fighting alongside the Dead Rabbits was a gang called the Shirt Tails, and they got their name from the simplest thing imaginable. They wore their shirts untucked, hanging outside their pants, like a uniform. In a neighborhood where everyone dressed in rags, that was how you identified a friendly, the Shirt Tails operated in the Mulberry Bend area and were known for their brutality in hand-to-hand combat. They weren't schemers. They weren't political. They were shock troops. When the Dead Rabbits needed bodies thrown into a street fight, the Shirt Tails showed up. Then there were the Plug Uglies. And you need to understand this name because everyone gets it wrong. Plug Ugly wasn't just a description. A plug was a tall stovepipe hat, and the Plug Uglies stuffed theirs with wool and leather and scraps of iron. When they pulled those hats down over their ears, they became helmets. A club would bounce off a properly prepared plug. So these men walked around 5 Points wearing armored top hats, which sounds ridiculous until you remember that the average street fight in 1855 involved paving stones, cudgels, and broken bottles. The Plug Uglies were also enormous. Most recruits were over 6 feet tall, which, in an era when the average American male was about 5'7", made them giants. They fought with boots reinforced with iron plates. They kicked men to death in the street, and they were one of the core Irish gangs that formed the Dead Rabbits Confederation on July 4th, 1857. The last of the Irish coalition, the O'Connell Guards, named themselves after Daniel O'Connell, the Irish liberator back home. They were slightly more disciplined than the others, more political, and they drew heavily from Irish veterans who had fought in various European conflicts before emigrating. The O'Connell Guards sometimes marched in quasi-military formation. They carried banners. They saw themselves not just as a street gang, but as the armed wing of Irish America. That vision would survive them. You can trace a direct line from the O'Connell Guards through the Fenian Brotherhood, through the Clan na Gael, all the way to the political organizations that eventually funded the IRA. The street gangs of 5 Points were connected, whether they knew it or not, to a transatlantic struggle that lasted more than a century. So that was one side of the war. The Irish Catholic Coalition, dozens of smaller crews, all loosely aligned under the banner of the Dead Rabbits. Now let's talk about who they were fighting. North of 5 Points, across Canal Street, sat the Bowery, and the Bowery was nativist territory. Nativist, in 1850s America, meant you believed that only white Protestants born on American soil had a right to be here. Everyone else, especially the Catholic Irish, was a threat to the Republic. The nativists had a political party, the American Party, better known as the Know-Nothings, because when asked about their activities, members were instructed to say, "I know nothing." And they had a street army, the Bowery Boys. The Bowery Boys were not just a gang. They were a subculture. A member of the Bowery Boys was called a Bowery Boy, spelled with an apostrophe to indicate the rough pronunciation. They had a uniform, tall silk stovepipe hat, soap-locked hair greased into long curls beside the ears, red flannel shirt, suspenders, tight trousers, and heavy boots. They chewed tobacco constantly. They swaggered. They were almost all volunteer firefighters, butchers, mechanics, and skilled tradesmen, meaning, unlike the desperate Irish immigrants, the Bowery Boys had jobs. They had political connections. They had rage. And their king was Bill the Butcher. His real name was William Poole. Born July 24th, 1821, in Sussex County, New Jersey. His family moved to New York when he was 10. His father ran a butcher's shop on Christopher Street, and Bill worked there from boyhood, which is where he got the knife skills that made him legendary. By his 20s, Poole owned his own butcher stall at Washington Market and had become the undisputed leader of the Bowery Boys. He was huge, over 6 feet tall, somewhere around 200 pounds of muscle, and he could throw a butcher's cleaver with enough accuracy to pin a cockroach to a wall at 20 paces. Witnesses swore they'd seen him do it. He was a bare-knuckle prize fighter. He was a political enforcer for the Know-Nothing Party, and he hated the Irish with a clarity that bordered on religious. Poole's downfall came in February 1855. He got into a confrontation at Stanwix Hall, a saloon at 579 Broadway, with a rival named John Morrissey, an Irish-born prize fighter backed by Tammany Hall. The first fight ended with Morrissey humiliated. But later that same night, Morrissey's friends, including a man named Louis Baker, came back to finish the job. Baker pulled a pistol and shot Poole at close range. Bill the Butcher lingered for 14 days. On March 8, 1855, before he died, he propped himself up on his deathbed, looked at his friends, and reportedly said, "Goodbye, boys. I die a true American." Those words, whether exactly as recorded or cleaned up by newspapers, became the rallying cry of the nativist movement. His funeral procession in Manhattan drew more than 5,000 mourners. Daniel Day-Lewis's character in the film is based directly on William Poole. The real man was arguably more dangerous than the one on screen. The Bowery Boys rarely fought alone. They rode with a coalition of smaller nativist gangs, and the film names them one by one. The American Guards operated in the Bowery district from the 1840s through the 60s. They wore stovepipe hats, similar to the Bowery Boys, and drew most of their membership from American-born mechanics and laborers. Their whole purpose was to push back against what they saw as an Irish invasion of their neighborhoods. They fought alongside the Bowery Boys at the draft riots and in the 5 Points battles, and they often served as polling place muscle for the Know-Nothing Party. The Atlantic Guards were another nativist unit, founded in the 1840s and headquartered near the Bowery. Their specialty was intimidation. On Election Day, they would surround a polling place and physically block immigrant voters from approaching the ballot box. They fought with brass knuckles, slungshots, which were leather pouches filled with lead on a cord, and short clubs designed for close-quarters work. The Atlantic Guards were smaller than the Bowery Boys, but no less violent, and they are named explicitly by Johnny Sirocco in the film as allies of Bill the Butcher. The slaughterhousers were something different. They worked in the slaughterhouses of the 4th Ward, down near the East River docks. These were men who spent their days up to their elbows in animal blood, killing hogs and cattle with knives and cleavers, and when they walked out into the street at the end of a shift, they were not in a mood to be crossed. The slaughterhousers didn't need weapons. They brought their cleavers from work. They knew exactly how to cut a living creature apart. In 5 Points folklore, you didn't want to see a slaughterhouser coming for you because he would kill you the way he killed a pig, quickly, efficiently, and without wasting motion. And finally, on the nativist side, the true blue Americans. They were almost more of a political club than a gang, composed mostly of American-born men who wore long black frock coats and tall hats and stood on street corners in the Bowery, making speeches about how the Pope was plotting to take over the United States. They rarely got into street fights themselves, but they provided the ideological fuel that the Bowery Boys and the other nativist gangs lit on fire. Today, we'd call them the propaganda arm. They published pamphlets. They organized rallies. They made nativism feel respectable. Together, these 6 groups, the Bowery Boys, the American Guards, the Atlantic Guards, the Slaughterhousers, the True Blue Americans, and the freestanding bands of native-born Americans formed the Anti-Irish Alliance. On the other side, the Dead Rabbits Federation, thousands of men on each side, and a neighborhood small enough that you could walk across it in 20 minutes. A collision was inevitable. But before we get to that collision, you have to understand that 5 Points had a second layer underneath the gang war. A whole underworld of specialized criminal crews that didn't care about Irish versus native, didn't care about politics, and existed only to rob, mug, and murder for profit. These are the gangs the movie lists in that breathless recruitment monologue, the ones that sound almost mythical, and every one of them was real. Start with the Daybreak Boys. They were river pirates, operating on the East River waterfront, and they were called Daybreak Boys because they did their work between midnight and dawn, rowing out in small skiffs to ships anchored in the harbor, boarding them silently, killing the night watchman if necessary, and stripping the cargo. Their leaders were Nicholas Saul and William Howlett, and when they were finally caught and hanged in 1853, Saul was 19 years old and Howlett was 20. Think about that. The most feared waterfront crew in New York was run by teenagers. By the time the Daybreak Boys were finally broken up, they had reportedly committed more than 20 murders and stolen cargo worth over $200,000 in 1850s money, which translates to well over $7 million in today's dollars. They operated out of a dive called the Hole in the Wall on Dover Street, where reportedly a bouncer named Gallus Mag wore a leather belt from which hung a collection of human ears she had bitten off during fights. The Swamp Angels were similar, but they worked a different stretch of the waterfront. Their specialty was the sewers. New York's new sewer system, built in the 1840s and 50s, created a network of tunnels beneath the 4th Ward that connected the East River docks to warehouses, basements, and tenements throughout the neighborhood. The Swamp Angels learned those tunnels. They would swim or wade through them at night, emerging under a targeted building, crack a floor from below, steal whatever they could carry, and disappear back into the sewers before anyone knew they had been there. The police could not follow them. Nobody could. The Swamp Angels were, for about a decade, essentially untouchable. The Frog Hollow Gang, sometimes called Frog Haulers in older accounts, were a rougher, less organized crew working the same waterfront territory. Their name came from their habit of hauling stolen goods through Frog Hollow, a marshy section of the Bronx where they would fence the stolen property and hide out when heat came down in Manhattan. They specialized in dock robberies and warehouse break-ins. The Little 40 Thieves were exactly what the name suggests. The children's division of the main 40 Thieves. Boys and girls between the ages of 10 and 16 who were trained as pickpockets, sneak thieves, and lookouts. They ran in packs through the 5 Points, stealing wallets from distracted tourists, climbing through ground floor windows, and occasionally acting as decoys for older gang members. It was a recruitment pipeline. Every major 5 Points gang drew its new members from the ranks of the Little 40 Thieves. If you were a 10-year-old orphan in 1850 New York, joining the Little 40 Thieves was not a choice. It was survival. The nightwalkers were prostitutes who doubled as robbery crews. A nightwalker would lure a drunk man into an alley or up to a rented room, and once he was alone, either her pimp would emerge from behind a curtain with a club, or she herself would pull a short blade from her stocking and do the job. The 5 Points had hundreds of these women. They worked out of concert saloons, panel houses, where the walls were rigged to slide open so accomplices could reach through and rifle the customers' pockets, and cheap tenement rooms rented by the hour. The nightwalker economy was enormous. A decent one could bring in more than $50 a week in stolen cash and watches, which was 5 times the wages of an honest factory worker. The rat pickers were perhaps the grimmest crew of all. The name was literal. They made their living collecting dead rats from the streets and alleys of 5 Points and selling them to rat-baiting pits where gamblers would bet on terriers fighting packs of rats in sunken wooden arenas. The most famous such pit was Kit Burns's Sportsman's Hall at 273 Water Street. A good rat could be sold for pennies. A great fighting dog could win its owner hundreds of dollars in a single night. The rat pickers were at the bottom of this economy, but they weren't just rat hunters. They used the work as cover. They moved through alleys at all hours. They knew every doorway, every cellar, every place a body could be hidden. When a rat picker offered to show you a shortcut, you did not follow him. The Broadway twisters worked further uptown, on Broadway itself, which by the 1850s had become the main commercial thoroughfare of New York. They were confidence men and muggers who specialized in tourists and out-of-town businessmen. Their technique was the twister. 2 or 3 gang members would bump into a mark on a crowded sidewalk. One man would grab the victim's arm and twist it hard behind his back, while another picked his pocket. And a third would shove the disoriented victim forward into the crowd and melt away. The whole thing took about 4 seconds. By the time the victim realized his wallet and watch were gone, the twisters were half a block away and heading into one of the narrow side streets that led back down toward 5 Points. And then there was the group the film calls the Righteousness. There is no gang by that exact name in the historical record, and most researchers believe the Righteousness was Scorsese's composite, a nod to the various religious reform societies, missionary gangs, and self-appointed street preachers who roamed 5 Points, trying to save souls and, often, getting beaten half to death for their trouble. The Methodist Ladies' Home Missionary Society set up a mission in the old 5 Points brewery in 1852. They sent young men and women into the worst tenements to distribute Bibles and recruit children for Sunday school. Some of those missionaries were genuine reformers. Others were connected to nativist politics and used religion as a cover for anti-Catholic intelligence gathering. Either way, they walked into the 5 Points expecting gratitude and found, more often than not, contempt and violence. When Johnny Sirocco mentions the Righteousness in that recruitment scene, he is speaking to a real phenomenon. The 5 Points was full of people who thought they were saviors. The gangs thought they were targets. Now we come to the Wildcards, the 2 figures who defy categorization but who the film makes unforgettable. Hellcat Maggie and the Black Joke Fire Brigade. Hellcat Maggie was almost certainly a real person, though her exact identity has been debated by historians for a century. Herbert Asbury, whose 1928 book, The Gangs of New York, is the primary source for Scorsese's film, describes her as a fierce female member of the Dead Rabbits. She filed her front teeth to sharp points. She wore brass fingernails fitted over her natural ones, filed to needles. She fought in the front rank of Dead Rabbits charges, screaming in Gaelic, and witnesses said she could tear a man's face off with her bare hands. Some historians have traced her to a real 5 Points character named Margaret Connor, who was arrested multiple times in the 1840s and 50s for assault, drunkenness, and disorderly conduct. Others believe she is a composite, built out of several violent Irish women who haunted the 5 Points bars. What's documented is that women fought in these gangs. They weren't auxiliaries. They weren't girlfriends. They were soldiers. And at the 4th of July riots of 1857, contemporary newspaper accounts describe women on both sides throwing bricks from upper windows, dragging wounded gang members into tenements, and in several cases closing with Bowery Boys and stabbing them with kitchen knives. Hellcat Maggie may be semi-legendary. The phenomenon she represents was absolutely real. The Black Joke Fire Brigade is a different kind of wild card, because they weren't a gang at all. They were a volunteer fire company. Engine Company Number 33, formed in the mid-1830s and nicknamed Black Joke after a privateer sloop that had captured a British warship during the War of 1812. Their firehouse was on East Broadway. And here is the thing about volunteer fire companies in 19th century New York. They were gangs, every one of them, before the professional New York City Fire Department was established in 1865. Fires were fought by competing volunteer companies, each of which was paid by insurance companies only if they arrived first and put out the fire. So when an alarm went up, multiple companies would race through the streets, sometimes fighting each other in the middle of an intersection, while a building burned down behind them. Engine Company 33, the Black Joke, was one of the roughest. Their members were mostly Irish American, mostly Democratic, and many of them were also dues-paying members of 5 Points gangs. A dead rabbit by night could be a Black Joke fireman by day. On July 13th, 1863, the Black Joke entered American history in the worst possible way. 2 days earlier, the first federal draft lottery of the Civil War had begun pulling names at the 9th District Draft Office at 3rd Avenue and 46th Street. Among the first names drawn were volunteer firemen from Engine Company Number 33. These men had expected an exemption. They did not get one. So, on the morning of the 13th, the Black Joke marched on the draft office, smashed down the doors, poured turpentine on the floors, set the building on fire, and then blocked rival fire companies from putting the blaze out. That single act kicked off the New York City draft riots, the worst civil disturbance in American history. For 4 days, mobs of mostly Irish laborers, furious at being drafted to fight a war to free black slaves, who would then, they believed, take their jobs, tore the city apart. They burned the Colored Orphan Asylum at 5th Avenue and 43rd Street. They lynched at least 11 black men in the streets. They fought pitched battles with police, and eventually with Union Army regiments rushed in from the Gettysburg battlefield to restore order. By the time it ended on July 16th, at least 119 people were dead, and probably many more, with entire neighborhoods in ruins. And the riot's first spark, the match that lit the whole thing, was struck by a gang of firefighters with one foot in a 5 Point street crew. That is the truth about the world of gangs of New York. It was not cleaner than the movie. It was filthier. It was not less violent. It was more violent. And the riot that closes the film, the clash between the Dead Rabbits and the Bowery Boys on the day the Union Army arrives, is a compression of two real events. The 5 Points riot of July 4th, 1857, when the Dead Rabbits and their allies fought the Bowery Boys for 2 full days until the militia arrived, and the draft riots of July 1863, when the Black Joke helped burn New York to the ground. Scorsese collapsed them into one sequence for dramatic reasons. The actual history took 6 years to unfold and cost hundreds of lives. Here's what the whole story really means. These gangs are not footnotes. They are the foundation. The 5 Points gangs invented the American template for organized crime. They perfected the alliance between a street army and a political machine, and Tammany Hall paid them in cash and jobs for delivering votes. That arrangement, gang plus party plus protection, is the exact arrangement that Paul Kelly's 5 Points gang used at the turn of the 20th century, and Paul Kelly's gang is where a young immigrant named Salvatore Lucania, who would rename himself Charles Lucky Luciano, learned the business. Lucky Luciano built the modern American Mafia. Al Capone got his start in the 5 Points gang before moving to Chicago. Johnny Torrio, Frankie Yale, Meyer Lansky's early associates, Bugsy Siegel's mentors, all of them, directly or indirectly, descend from the neighborhood where the 40 thieves opened shop in a grocery back room in 1825. When you watch Gangs of New York and Leonardo DiCaprio's character rattles off that list of crews at recruitment time, you are not hearing a Hollywood screenwriter's invention. You are hearing a roll call of the organizations that built the underworld architecture of the United States. The Dead Rabbits and the Plug Uglies and the Swamp Angels and the Daybreak Boys didn't just fight in the streets. They built a system. And that system, the marriage of street violence, ethnic loyalty, and political cover, is the reason the American Mafia looked the way it did for the next 150 years. Hellcat Maggie, whether she was one woman or a legend built out of 10, represents something the history books still don't know how to talk about. The women of 5 Points were not victims. Many of them were killers. The Black Joke Fire Brigade, in one morning, lit the fuse on an insurrection that killed more Americans than any urban riot before or since. Bill the Butcher died on a mattress in a rented room with his best friend's hand in his, and the words, "I die, a true American," on his lips, and those words became a recruitment slogan for a political movement that would mutate into the Know-Nothing Party, the Native American Party, and eventually into a strain of American nativism that has never really gone away. Every one of these gangs is gone now. The Dead Rabbits dissolved in the 1860s. The Bowery Boys faded after the Civil War. The Swamp Angels were broken when the police finally blocked up the sewer tunnels they'd been using. The 5 Points itself was demolished at the turn of the 20th century, and a courthouse and a park now stand where the old brewery used to be. But the blueprint survived. Every gang war in American history, from the Irish versus Italian wars of the 1910s to the crack-era battles of the 1980s, follows the pattern that was burned into the American city in the gutters of Paradise Square. So now you understand the movie, better than Scorsese's own cast did, to be honest. Because when Leonardo DiCaprio talks about the Nightwalkers and the Rat Pickers and the Broadway Twisters, he is reciting a real genealogy of violence. Those weren't throwaway lines. They were the truth, delivered so fast that almost nobody watching caught it. The gangs were real. The names were real. The armored hats, the filed teeth, the impaled rabbits, the sewer raids, the stovepipe brigades, the Dead Rabbit riots, the Black Joke burning down the draft office, the dying words of a butcher who believed God was on the side of the American-born, all of it real. That is the story Scorsese was actually trying to tell. Not a movie about Irish immigrants and nativists fighting in the street. A movie about how the United States itself was born, in blood and ballot boxes and backroom grocery stores, out of the filthiest square mile in 19th century New York. And when that final riot ends, when the cannons of the Union Navy shell the 5 Points from New York Harbor, and Bill the Butcher dies in the rubble with Amsterdam Vallon standing over him, what Scorsese is actually showing you is the death of one era of American crime and the birth of another. The street gangs end. The Mafia begins. And the line between them runs right through the back room of Rosanna Pierce's grocery store, where 40 men in 1825 decided to stop being victims and start being a gang. If you found this story fascinating, hit subscribe. We drop a new mob documentary every week. Drop a comment. Which gang from 5 Points do you want us to cover in a full episode next? The Dead Rabbits, the Bowery Boys, or the Black Joke Fire Brigade that burned down New York? Let us know below.